Hello, everybody. This is Gary. Today is Tuesday, December 17th, 2019. It is 3:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in Rochester, New York. And this is my coping with schizophrenia vlog entry for today. Um, I was just watching the Ben Shapiro show on YouTube. He has a full hour of a podcast or a broadcast that he does. Um, And most of his talks lately have been about the impeachment hearings and impeaching Donald Trump. But before he got into that subject again, he did an opening on his show about mentally ill people and who are homeless and living in cities like uh, Los Angeles, San Francisco, um, and other large cities of, that have huge amounts of homeless mentally ill people. Um, and they're just sort of like making these cities disaster areas. There's human feces all over the place. There's drug needles. Um, so you're dealing with people who are actively using drugs, who are mentally ill, not taking their medication, and there's tens of thousands of people like that in cities like San Francisco. You can't go into any part of the city without coming across human feces everywhere. And in Ben Shapiro's show, he actually shows a photograph of somebody who decided to take a dump in a hallway, or not a hallway, an aisleway of a local supermarket. And they actually went to the aisle that had the toilet paper, took a crap on the floor, and used the toilet paper. Um, I know that I shouldn't be smiling, I should be laughing at that because it's really, really sad about how bad homelessness has gotten in some of these larger cities. Even to some extent in Rochester, New York. Not as bad as San Francisco, though. Rochester is a medium sized city compared to, say, Los Angeles, San Francisco, or New York City. Um, so, a lot of mentally ill people who are homeless may end up in jail because they're breaking the law by encamping on public sidewalks or under freeways. The reason a person would camp under a freeway, if you think about it, is a highway that's elevated would block some of the snowfall on the person who's living in a tent below that highway. Um, some people in Rochester, New York, who are homeless and mentally ill would sleep in an abandoned subway tunnel. Rochester tried building the subway. For some reason, they gave it up, and the tunnel was still there. I think it's been closed up since then. It's been filled in, but it was not unusual for mentally ill homeless people to go into the abandoned subway and sleep there to get some protection from the elements. But mentally ill people need to take some responsibility for their own homelessness. If somebody doesn't take their medication like I do, and I take 7 medications, if people are not willing to take their medications, uh, then of course they're going to be homeless. You can't control your own schizophrenia. It doesn't work that way. You have to be on medication. And I know that mental hospitals, particularly state mental hospitals, not just in New York State, but I believe in all 50 states there was a version of state mental hospitals of one kind or another. And yeah, some people had been there for 20 or 30 years. They started to close mental hospitals in the 1960s, right up through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because in 1998, I believe, they finally closed the state hospital in Rochester, New York, called Rochester Psychiatric Center. I believe it had like 1,000 patients in a 15-story building. But they started closing those mental hospitals with the expectation that newly discovered psychiatric drugs in the 1950s would make it unnecessary for people to be put in mental hospitals. Well, it just doesn't work out that way. Obviously, a person who's mentally ill has to take their medicine. But for people who are severely mentally ill, even more than I am, um, you may have to force them to take medication. Um, and I know that sounds cruel and inhumane, and a lot of people get mad at me for saying that. But right now, a lot of mentally ill people, when they're arrested for and can't be on a public sidewalk, they end up in jail. So my idea is that the government, whether it's the federal government or the state governments or county governments, whatever it happens to be, mental hospitals should be rebuilt and reopened that never should have closed in the first place, and force people into those hospitals if necessary, because if a mentally ill person or a drug user isn't willing to get treatment, then like in the old times, in the days of old, they should be able to force people into a mental hospital. Um, because the medications help me, for example, not be homeless, but that doesn't work for everybody. Some people's mental illness are worse than mine. And medications alone is not enough to suddenly make a person cured and be able to live outside the hospital environment, because there's some people who can't live outside of a hospital environment. And there's a lot of them who can't do that. Um, I'm on Social Security disability. I'm not an idiot. I know if I don't take my meds, I lose my Social Security. Because if I'm claiming that I have a mental disability and that's the basis for my Social Security, then obviously Social Security expects me to be in treatment for my disability, even if I'm never cured. You have to make the effort. Why would anybody give me money for a disability if I'm not willing to get the disability treated? I'm not completely stupid. But my idea is that since mentally ill people are ending up in county jails and in some cases state prisons, why is it any less humane to just rebuild fucking hospitals that never should have been closed in the first place and force people into them? Um, it seems like common sense to me. When the first psychiatric drugs were being developed in the 1950s, I believe one of the very first was Thorazine. Thorazine's notorious among mentally ill people. Um, and then other drugs like that came out afterward, Prolixin, Navaine, among others. And then newer psychiatric medications like Zyprexa and Seroquel were developed and are available. But those drugs by themselves aren't necessarily going to keep all mentally ill people off the streets. Um, so it's kind of a weird situation. The medications are necessary, like in my case, to not be homeless. But my schizophrenia isn't so bad that when I take my meds, I know that I need to take them and I'm aware of what they're doing for me. A lot of mentally ill people who can't take care of themselves need to be in hospitals. I'm not saying we should go back to the snake pit type hospitals where patients sat in their own feces and urine for days on end. Um, Obviously, that's not what I'm advocating, but mental hospitals in Rochester have been closed left and right. At least three of them that I could think of. I went to the psychiatric emergency room just a couple of weeks ago. It's total fucking chaos. They don't have enough beds for mentally ill people. And the only way you can get into the hospital is if you're suicidal or violent or potentially violent. Those are the criteria for hospitalizing somebody. It used to be, like Ben Shapiro says, that if you were unable to take care of yourselves, then you would end up in a mental hospital. But now it's strictly if you're violent, potentially violent, suicidal, potentially suicidal, those are the requirements necessary to be put into a hospital, either voluntarily or involuntarily. If you're homeless and unable to take care of yourself, the hospital is not going to admit you. It doesn't matter if you're unable to take care of yourself. And Ben Shapiro is a conservative uh, political commentator. I don't agree with everything he says, but he did admit that one thing the government should be involved in, again, is mental health treatment. As a conservative, he doesn't like big government, he doesn't like government spending, but he does believe that the one area that the government needs to intervene is in mental health care. And in my opinion, not that Ben Shapiro said this, but in my opinion, those mentally ill people need to be reinstitutionalized, because what they call deinstitutionalization in the 1960s hasn't done anything to improve the lives of the mentally ill. It doesn't protect their civil rights. It makes them become homeless, criminals, drug addicts, alcoholics. Um, why should San Francisco's people or Los Angeles or New York City have to live in feces. I mean, literally living in feces on the sidewalk. They're actually afraid in places like San Francisco that diseases that were thought to be gone long ago are coming back, like the plague, the bubonic plague. Um, and the situation is obvious that deinstitutionalization hasn't worked. Some mentally ill people will never recover completely, even when they take their meds, and they need to be in hospitals. A lot of people aren't going to like me saying that, but the alternative of arresting people and putting them in jail, that's not more humane than a mental hospital. That's a lot less humane. I've seen documentaries on the mentally ill in county jails and even in state prisons. They're treated like shit because they're prisons. They're not hospitals. They're not meant to be hospitals. Um, but I believe states like New York and other states, whether it's California, whether it's Oregon, whether it's Texas, whether it's Florida, whatever, they need to rebuild hospitals and have oversight so they're not treating patients horribly, which used to be the case. There was a movie out, I believe, in the 1950s or the 1960s called The Snake Pit, and that's what a lot of the hospitals were, treating the mentally ill as less than animals. And that's not what I'm advocating. Um, but, you know, Ben Shapiro is correct that the approaches to homelessness and mental illness hasn't worked. And my idea is forcing people into mental hospitals if they can't take care of themselves, including taking their meds. Of course, we should do that with civil rights in mind. There should be a way for people who are possibly forced into the hospitals to have hearings before a judge. That's what we have in New York State. It's called the Mental Hygiene Arrest Law. You can arrest people under the hygiene law uh, and bring them to a hospital for evaluation. The police can do that without actually charging the person with the crime, because a lot of the time, mentally ill people haven't committed a crime, but they might, and you can have a mental hygiene arrest and then taken to a hospital for evaluation. That doesn't appear on your record as a criminal record because there's no charges being filed. It's just a way for New York State to try to deal with potentially mentally ill people who are violent or potentially violent. Um, and if you are brought to a hospital and hospitalized against your will, there's a court system set up where you can go to a judge and explain why you don't believe you need to be hospitalized. I tried that myself and I lost. I ended up in the hospital against my will. Um, but I don't know. It's just total chaos. I went to the mental health emergency room, like I said, I think it was about 2 weeks ago. And it's fucking chaos. They didn't have anywhere near enough beds for the people who they wanted to put in the hospital. Eventually, I got out after 3 days. Spending any more time in the emergency room just waiting for a bed, uh, I couldn't do it. And it wasn't absolutely necessary for me to be in the hospital. So after 3 or 4 days of that, I left. And I take my meds. Mentally ill people have to take some responsibility for taking their meds and not using drugs. Um, and there's nothing more humane about throwing people in jail. If you're going to do that, you might as well just build fucking mental hospitals. The money you're spending on the mentally ill in county and state prisons is fucking ridiculous. You're not, if you're a state, you're not going to save money by closing hospitals and then throwing people into prison. You're spending a lot more money per mentally ill person by throwing them in jail. That's not a good alternative. Um, and so I don't know. It's hard to say what should be done, but American cities are falling apart at the seams. As Ben Shapiro said, some of the larger cities in America are collapsing in on themselves like they were a dying star turning into a black hole. Um, but that's all I got to say for now. Share, like, subscribe, comment. Um, if you have any suggestions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. If you have an idea for a video you want me to do, go ahead and put it in the comment section. I'm always open to ideas.